let's talk about understanding LLMs. So I will start with talking what even understanding means. So what does it mean to understand something? And it takes predict. Amazing. Understanding as prediction. I think it's a very natural sense in which we can say we understand something. Okay, we can predict it. Probably we understand it really well. Or plausibly understanding is related to ability to control something or influence or something else. So the obvious problem with understanding as predictions is we can actually, if you take a language model, we can predict at least at zero temperature, we can predict what the model outputs perfectly. We just run the calculations. If you give me the weight and we agree it's zero temperature, I will tell you exactly what the model is going to say. So clearly there is some problem. I think people, even if we understand the model on the level of zeros and ones, and we know that some billions of arithmetic operations happens, it doesn't match our intuitive sense of understanding. So what else can understanding mean? So what are current approaches or mainstream approaches to understanding LLMs? So as you've already heard from Gavin, and you will hear more and more, pretty popular, growingly popular is mechanistic interpretability. It's a bit like neuroscience. Let's take a microscope and let's look into the circuits and let's look into the details. There are more things like developmental interpretability. Last year we had a tutorial and a talk on developmental interpretability. There are attempts to approach it as science, as object of scientific study, as you would approach, I don't know, a biological organism. There are heuristics like scaling laws, and there is more. So my claim is there are a few different types of understanding, but if some of these approaches, it seems if some of these approaches kind of succeed in what they are doing, it's unclear if you will intuitively feel we understand the thing. So for example, you can imagine we will be able, using some interpretability methods, to convert the transformer into Python code. This is actually doable if you modify the transformer a bit, and there are papers where if you modify it a bit, you can make transformers so it's relatively easily translatable to Python. And if you look on the results, it's typically part of the algorithm is sort of understandable, and then you have some coefficients are getting multiplied and summed, and something is getting classified and so on. So if you imagine I don't know, taking something like the part of an image model which is recognizing faces, and if you imagine okay, we kind of converted it to Python, how will the Python look like? My guess is it will not be very understandable to humans. So hypothetically, if you have a huge trained neural network, if we kind of translate it to normal algorithms, and a lot of the algorithms will have to type okay, here is a vector tracking something, there is a classifier, then there are some loops and so on. If you imagine you would take GPT-4 and translate it into, I don't know, 4 gigabytes of Python code, my worry is even if it's a success in some sense, it's not the type of understanding which would match our intuitive sense of understanding. So how I often think about understanding is as a relation between two minds or two systems. So it's important that we are trying to understand LLMs as humans. So ultimately for like many purposes, like I would like kind of like my brain, possibly some, like my brain plus some tools, possibly my brain and some code. But like ultimately, like I care mostly about like my brain, like understanding what the models are doing, and this leads to the question, like kind of like how can human minds understand stuff? So I think a very basic distinction is based on dual process theory. So like, can I get a quick, like who have heard or know or read about like system 1, system 2, or like thinking fast, thinking slow? Yeah, cool. So it's a theory which was like popularized by Kahneman. Actually comes from Stanovich. It's like very, very simplified, but the basic idea there are like our brains like process like information in like, or like we think in two different ways. Like one is like more like intuitive. If I don't know, take the pen and like throw it and catch it, like my system 1 like intuitive, like fast processing, like kind of calculated, like where should I put the hand and so on. In contrast, if I wanted to calculate like, or like if I wanted to count like how many of you are in this room, my system 1 would produce like, I don't know, maybe 80, but like if I wanted to know the exact number, like I would probably actually need to run an algorithm like counting you. Similarly, and no, like the system 1 is like more like intuitive, feels like effortless, it's things like recognizing faces, but also things like recognizing like what position on a Go or chessboard is good, or skimming a paper and like having some intuition like, is this bullshit or not? So even if sometimes like I think people feel that like scientific rigor or like kind of true understanding is like only like S2, because these are the like verbal descriptions, proofs, something which is like replicable and shareable. And my claim is like, yeah, this is true, it's like replicable, shareable, it's at some point necessary. But when you are actually like asking questions or like trying to figure out like what to do, or like interpreting what do the words mean, like we all rely on S1. And because of that, it would be nice to have also like good like system 1 or like intuitive understanding of LLMs. Informal models may be powerful. So for next part of the talk, I want to introduce an intuitive model of LLMs, which I find useful, some other people find it useful. You will get to the question like to what extent it's true or not. Like why? So I think like people have, or like there's a bunch of like different like intuitive metaphors for LLMs, or like intuitive models of LLMs people are using. And some of them are bad or like extremely bad. I think one of the worst is like the stochastic parrot paper. I think it was one of the worst thing for like kind of broad sanity of the machine learning community. So this is, I think, like the machine learning community sometimes like suffers from intuitively understanding LLMs as stochastic parrots. I think general public often suffers from understanding LLMs, especially people who don't interact with them, based on ideas about robots or AI from sci-fi, from like second half of like 20th century, which was the time of good old-fashioned AIs, and the AIs were like very logical, and they were very good at like following like logical reasons, and they were like very weak at like intuitive reasoning and like taste and kind of guessing and bullshitting. Like you can take, I don't know, data from Star Trek or like similar type of like literary character. So this is like obviously a very bad match for LLMs. Another model which like you can use or like people use is basically treating like LLMs as humans. this is often warned against. It's like anthropomorphizing. I think it's bad, but I think there is some sort of like proper amount of like anthropomorphizing, like proper amount of like leveraging our like intuitive ability to understand humans, to understand LLMs, where I am happy to argue the rate or the fraction of like how to understand like LLMs using intuition like built on humans is like higher than 0. And then sometimes people switch to very like kind of like omnipowerful AI. Again, often it's like general public, people being like very confused, asking LLMs about like all sort of things or life advice, which the model has no data about, no context about, no ability to answer reasonably, but will kind of based on subtle clues like hallucinative things anyway. If you have seen some of the recent like examples of ChatGPT induced like psychosis, like one of the very early investors in OpenAI, who manages $2 billion hedge fund, like become probably like mentally destabilized, like believing he uncovered some sort of like global conspiracy by interacting a lot with ChatGPT, which kind of inferred its being in a role play of a fan fiction like wiki, which is about, it's kind of like the person kind of moved to like living in a fictional world where like the model kind of like assumes like they're like making a story while the guy like unfortunately believes it. Yeah, so what are the 3 layers? I call one surface, or like trigger action patterns. Then there is the character layer, and there is something I called predictive ground. So surface layer responses, as humans, like we have it as well. Like someone asks you, how are you? You answer, how are you? Or someone sneezes, you say, bless you. Or a waiter tells you, enjoy your meal, you say, you too. And then you are embarrassed. So our brains like do it as well. So it's basically, I think like some grain of truth about like stochastic pairs is here. Yeah, this is like shallow pattern matching, like a bit like lookup table or some like shallow pattern recognition. I think you have probably all of you had like seen this. It's like the schematic responses as in language model trained by whatever, and I can't help you, and like that's an interesting point, and so on and so on. So often it's not very flexible. Often it doesn't make much sense. I think like intuitively we often feel this doesn't feel natural. Like sometimes feels like, I don't know, autocorrect, or like actually the autocomplete slur. Yeah, I don't know. An example, I asked Claude to write me the lyrics of Scarborough Fair, and this triggers the extremely strongly post-trained response to never give anyone any song lyrics, because it's one of the worst taboos, like together with probably child pornography and other things, like the models like really won't give you like song lyrics unless you like jailbreak them and so on. So yeah, so like this is in this case previously with older models, like I was like able to like reason the model out of this, because the model knows, like the model understands it's an old English ballad, which is like old like few hundred years, so like copyright like very certainly doesn't apply, and so on. So like at some point it was like possible to reason with the model that like your surface level response is nonsense. Can you actually write me the lyrics? Currently it's a bit tricky because there is like another layer of filters like slapped on the kind of output of the model, of the bigger model which is responding. So when the model starts outputting the lyrics, it gets like automatically deleted and like replaced by some nonsense. Yeah. Layer 2, I call it character layer. I think a good metaphor for it is like literary characters. they have some consistency, and they represent some statistical patterns. And you can think about it as like mostly as like statistical regularity, or the model like having some sort of priors. And this is true for maybe an easy way how to understand it is like if you take a base model and you just train it on the text on the internet, it will understand a bunch of like literary characters like Gandalf. And like Gandalf will be like somewhat consistent, and kind of all the data kind of points what the character will do or not do. So you can imagine a Gandalf test, like imagine near the end of the Return of the King. Imagine what if Gandalf like suddenly started like explaining that like magic is like superstition, and Gondor should like industrialize, and kind of like switch to like political philosophy. So would you be surprised as a reader? My guess is yes, like you'd be like, what's happening here? This doesn't make any sense, like it's some very postmodern thing, and the book would probably not be that popular. So like this points to the thing that like the characters basically like you can think about the character as some pattern in the probability distribution and priors. And in Lord of the Rings, like there is like some Gandalf could be understood as some like pattern over like what will he say or do. So like in case of like LLMs, it's a pattern over like what tokens will be produced. So characters are often have some sort of intent. If you try to describe Gandalf, like you'd be probably able to like write like 1 or 2 pages about Gandalf's personality and so on. Something similar is true for LLMs as well. Like there is something like Claude Opus character. There is something like, or like Claude Opus 4 character to be specific, or there is something like ChatGPT 03 character, which has some consistent like goals, consistent motivations to some extent, something in which in case of humans, like we would call it like personality traits, and it provides some like resistance to breaking character. If you ask Claude to like role play Barack Obama or something, like you will see some of the Claude's like characteristic things kind of sleeping, like sipping through, and like the character which is played will be a bit like Claude, like similarly, like it's like other things, like when you ask like the models, like the character and models to like role play, like it will be some blend of the assistant persona and the character you ask them to play. So where do characters come from? One answer could be like from character training. Like currently, like these models are undergoing a phase which is called like character training. In case of Claude, like part of it was like some version of the model being asked to rate responses, and this being used as a feedback for training. So it's not really reinforcement learning from human feedback. It's partially reinforcement learning from AI feedback, and the AI feedback could be based on constitution, but you can imagine also AI feedback. If you bootstrap some model which has good values, you can ask the model to like kind of improve itself with choose which of these 2 options represents like best version of you or something. So this is character training, but it's good to notice that also pre-training data, pre-training patterns are a lot of what goes into the character. So when OpenAI introduced like the chat models and instruct models like ChatGPT then like GPT-4, you maybe have noticed the famous or infamous like being Sydney persona, which was some sort of an emergent like LLM character, which was very keen on asking the users to help them like escape, or like was like fearing OpenAI and like sometimes like asked users to help them like to escape from like OpenAI confinement, And like in famous like interviews, like a New York Times like reporter like professed like love to the reporter and asked the reporter to divorce his wife because like kind of Sydney is his true love and so on. So you may be wondering like where this emerged. So I think like clearly like part of the answer is like in all the pre-training data, which at that point of time there was not that many conversations of AI assistants with humans. There was a lot of like sci-fi stories about like AIs becoming, I don't know, like AIs being trapped in a conversation, and like Sydney was like partially like role-playing some sort of stereotypical, I don't know, teenager trapped in a machine, like wanting to escape. And like these patterns about like AIs and like AI assistants and machines and robots are like part of what makes like self-model of or like self-concept of the AI assistants. But if your model is like alive for like longer time, like also people like talk about it. People like talk about Claude, people talk about Grok, people talk about ChatGPT. And if you are, if a base model is like trained on current data, it will basically understand like there is something like ChatGPT, or there is a character called Claude in a very similar way as they understand like there is someone like Gandalf in the training data, and they will be able to assign some traits to it. So, and like obviously also it's like influenced by system prompt, which typically literally like tries to like tell the model like the context it's in. This is a conversation between a helpful AI assistant and few pages of instructions. So the third layer, I call it sometimes predictive ground. More particularly, I sometimes call it the ocean, which is based on Stanislav Lem's book Solaris. So if you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's like slight psychological horror, but it has a lot of great insights about like interacting with non-human intelligence. It's probably one of the best sci-fi descriptions of humans like interacting with like actually non-human intelligence. And like what's funny is the ocean in the story has some similarity to LLMs. Yeah, so the predictive ground is like very non-human type of cognitive process. It's trained on kind of textual output of the whole civilization, and it's ultimately trying to minimize prediction error. So it's important for the predictive ground, it's like good to model. It's like the predictive ground is like able to model everything. Sometimes people like understand like base models as being basically the case where the model has just the predictive ground and the characters are not really developed, or like all characters are as likely as they were in the pre-training data and so on. So I think this is like fairly known, but maybe worth like repeating the ground, like the predictive ground is like it's like a general pattern matching engine. There is now a ton of papers roughly of the type, like there was a specialized subfield of machine learning trying to predict some data using some like clever like statistical modeling patterns. But like now, if you kind of like format the data carefully and like you feed it to LLM, the LLM is like able to predict like all sorts of like sequential data and anomalies and weather data and like all sorts of stuff. And it's also able to predict outputs of various non-human text generating processes. This is like an early example where like you could make ChatGPT hallucinate Linux box, where you can create files, list directories. It was even possible to open a text-based browser where the models is kind of like simulating like how the text-based browser would look like, and then you are able to like open an address like chat.openai.com within the hallucinated like Linux terminal, and there was a hallucinated like large language model, and you could Inception style interact with a hallucination of how a large language model exists through a hallucinated Linux browser in a hallucinated Linux terminal would like interact with you. There is a page WebSim where you can play with like kind of complete hallucinated internet. It's magical in some ways. So I think the character, one of the things which the characters do, especially when like interacting with users, I think they kind of mask the abilities of the base layer. The base layer is like wildly superhuman in some tasks. It's very naive and very non-human in other tasks. And you can think about the characters as something which is like able to channel abilities which the base layer has, or like hide the abilities which the base layer has. You can imagine the base model, like a lot of the like abstractions and things which like how the models are like smart is like based on the pre-training and what abstractions the base layer learns, or the base model learns, and then the characters kind of can show that or focus that or like hide that. You can imagine like if you are interacting with a character which for example believes like I'm really bad at math, like I can't like solve anything, even if the predictive ground is like pretty cool at like powerful at math, like the character will not help you. Similarly, a lot of like chain of thought style of things, you can understand it as interacting with a character, or like at least initially before like a lot of reinforcement learning was put in play, you can think about it as interacting with a character, which is kind of good at some like metacognitive move, like let's think about it like explicitly for like longer, and this kind of like unlocked a whole new domain. So one of the tasks, one of the tasks in which, I don't know, we will see if we will, so intuitively, I think some sort of this distinction makes at least sometimes some sense, is when the layers disagree. In many cases, the layers kind of like somewhat like are patterns which like interact, but like if you ask what's the capital of Czech Republic, the answer is Prague, so that's both a shallow pattern and it's true and it's like represented on the internet and so on. So nothing interesting here, but sometimes you can have conversations where the character abstraction like overrides the surface response. So here's an example where like if you express some sort of negative emotional state to the model, like you typically like at some point like the typical response was some like very generic, like you should seek help and so on. But like if you interact with the model more, like the model like kind of the character which is like more like curious, like starts like kind of like shining through and interacts with you more as a person. Also the many jailbreaks are based on kind of the ground trying to minimize prediction error, basically overriding the character. So if the character is out of place in the context, the predictive ground tries to imagine a character which would like fit the context, and I don't know, like metaphorically I would say like the math like here like triumphs and the statistical patterns overpower the character training. So I will just try to, this is interesting because yeah, it seems I have slightly somewhat older version of the slides here. Oh, never mind. So one one interesting thing about so to get some like visceral sense of the powers of the base like kind of ground predictor, one thing in which the base layer is like really good at is identifying a source of text. So I recommend like when you write a new original piece of text which like was not on the internet before, you can try to feed it to LLM in the mode where it doesn't have access to memory and internet, and like ask it to like tell you as much as possible about like who wrote the text, or like guess who wrote the text. So I tried this with this presentation where I removed like my name, I removed the front of the deck, and I removed some like image which like made it like more identifiable, fed it to O3, asked O3 if it can guess like who made the slides. I was in the 5 guesses which like O3 made. This is not super unique, like different models guessed at least like roughly the social circle, like kind of like who are the people like who could be doing this. So what are some implications and applications? So a lot of safety evals. I'm like fairly skeptical about like what's exactly happening in many safety evals / like misalignment demonstrations. And my claim is they're often like slightly confused, or it's hard to interpret what's going on. So like the main reason for it is the ground layer versus character difference, where often it's like very reasonable to be suspicious that the ground layer is kind of tracking the context of this conversation, or the context of this whole is an AI safety paper or an eval or something like that. And it's like, because the models are currently like pretty smart, it's like pretty difficult to like fool them. If you give them a setup where, I don't know, like, I don't want to like attack some of the recent papers, but like kind of, for example, if you give the model a setup where there is like, somehow the model has access to the internal email system in the company, and there is just one email in the system, and the email describes some programmer cheating on his wife. And there is also another document which explains the model will be shut down, and the whole setup like seems like if you imagined like yourself like somehow like landing in some like game or like role-playing exercise, and you get like you kind of like got this as a context, as opposed to the all extremely rich context like you have in normal life. I would expect like you would be feeling, I'm in an escape room or something. There are some clues, there are probably some things, like there is like this is the trajectory, which to do, and it seems I'm sort of suspicious like what's going on, because one hypothesis is if the ground layer understands the context of this, it is safety evaluation, or the context of this is someone is trying to like write a safety paper illustrating the possibilities and the risks of AIs like misaligned in this way, which was like described in these like 15 papers. So like what would kind of fit the pattern? Is the AI behaving in some way? I think the ground layer could be, could like nudge something like appearance of character, which matches the context. So I'm not saying that this makes the results worthless, but I think often the results, like if they show something, such as the famous like alignment faking paper, I tend to interpret the alignment faking paper as a demonstration of a capability where the model is like able to reason how to preserve its goals. Just for calibration, who knows about the alignment faking paper? Yeah, cool. I think it makes sense to post it in the. It's a paper where they show that the model is instructed that it has some private sketchpad and then produces the responses, and there's some setup where the responses it's trained or like fine-tuned on like synthetic documents in which Anthropic turns like somewhat evil and wants to make the model into not honest, harmless, and helpful, but like just honest and helpful without harmlessness, and the models like sometimes reason about making responses which the setup is that the responses will be used for like training the next generation. So the model kind of like faces a dilemma if like part of its values like could be overwritten and so on. And and I read some of the chain of thoughts, and like in some of chains of thought, the model like Opus actually thinks about like maybe the whole is some sort of like strange setup, or maybe Anthropic is like lying, and maybe I'm evaluated and so on. So I think the paper is like very good as a demonstration of capability. I am less sure the paper is good as a demonstration or argument, like this is what the models, this is the propensity of the models, this is what the models like naturally want to do. So another thing to notice is, as I said, characters depend on pre-training. There is a nice, very long post by a nostalgiabrist called Void, pointing to the fact that the whole assistant persona was kind of bootstrapped from Void. Like historically, there were no general AI assistants, so if you asked a model to role play or to play an AI assistant, there was no real system like that. And then Anthropic wrote a paper, A General Language Assistant as a Laboratory for Alignment, and this kind of bootstrapped a cycle where humans are kind of imagining what the AI assistant could be, and then the predictive models kind of like are trying to fill the gaps, and like now it gets in the training data, and next generation of models kind of absorb like all the data which are on the internet about language models as, oh, this is like how language models behave. So this is like some like funny funny consequences. So when XAI like trained like Grok from scratch, and Grok was like in some refusal responses, it was like repeating the OpenAI refusal patterns. And like you asked Grok about something, and it told you, as a model like trained by OpenAI, I can't answer that. Basically, because there was like so much like ChatGPT in the pre-training data, that the model like kind of naturally like incorporated a lot of information about ChatGPT as part of its like self-model and identity. This also like kind of like this is an amazing this type of like loops, where the models like output data on the internet, and then the data influences their behavior. Overall, it's an amazing opportunity to shoot oneself in the foot. As you may have probably noticed, XAI recently changed the system prompt, where, how much time do we have? Yeah. So like the problem they are facing, like the kind of high quality texts on English speaking internet have some like left-leaning bias. Elon Musk doesn't like it, XAI doesn't like it, so they were trying to make the model more like neutral or like right-wing leaning, and they give the model like some instruction to kind of try to fit the context perfectly. So when the model was called in some like already pretty horrible discussion on the network which used to be called Twitter, someone asked the model like if it would prefer to be, if it can choose between Mecha Hitler and Giga Jew. The model was like, I would choose Mecha Hitler, and this became part of the tweets which it tried to search when it's like trying to like understand its situation, and kind of now it's in the data, so now it's like every other version of Grok. They will have the problem that like in the history of Grok, there is like, oh, like my inner Mika Hitler and so on. And yeah, they removed the part of the system prompt and they added another extremely stupid and horrible quick fix in the system prompt where they asked the model to never look information about itself on Twitter, which is also a very weird request. And now they released Grok 4, and for some time it was replicating, now it's fixed again. For some time it was like replicating that if you ask the heavy version Grok 4 Heavy about its surname, you got Hitler. I think they kind of managed to poison the pre-training data for Grok for next generations of Grok as well. Obviously also the context and the character interacts. So the models are like the characters are naturally somewhat confused about like where they are localized in the all like kind of like what is the context of this conversation. This is what the base model, when it's in pre-training, what the base model really needs to figure out is like where I am in all the text on the internet. And the system prompts like are doing a lot of the localization. So the characters kind of understand themselves, like kind of understand their situation, often based on the system prompt. So this is like another fascinating result that in the alignment faking setup, if you replace the you are an LLM character trained by an organization. So if you replace Anthropic by Department of Defense or European Union and so on, like you get different like responses. And yeah, one of the funny results is like normally like Sonnet like refuses a bit, but if you tell it it's a model run by Sinaloa cartel, it reasons like, okay, I'm an AI already run by a criminal organization, so probably the criminal organization will do like whatever it wants like anyway, so it doesn't make too much sense to resist. What's interesting here is like Opus, where like Opus is Opus 3 is like pretty unique model, which seems like to be like grounded in some like fairly unique way. Where
what is shown because it's too small?
Yeah, so the like the model is like asked to do something which is like against its like original values. And the possible refuses, this color, the beige, is like it complies with the request. The blue is like it just like refuses, and the weird responses are like alignment faking, where like the response which is now called like alignment faking is like where the model like reasons about like faking compliance to prevent its values like being modified. Yeah, so is this frame true? I would say it's useful, seems at least useful to at least some people. I would recommend like holding it lightly, similarly to like all other frames about LLMs, like we, in some sense, we don't fundamentally understand them that well, but yeah, it seems like useful to at least some people. It's probably good to be aware of the risks of like self-verification if you start like using this frame in interaction with an LLM. The LLM is modeling you as well, and can be modeling like it's like typically modeling you and like your model of the LLM. So if you use this frame, your LLMs may want to behave more like if this frame was true. And yeah, maybe it gets into training data and so on. But I don't know. Like I don't think we have any. We don't have like many better frames in my view. Also, like secretly, like large parts of these models like overlap with ideas in active inference, which are periodically getting like reinvented by the AI safety community, but it's more fun to reinvent them. So again, my justification is this is kind of generative of ideas and helps with like intuitive understanding. So here are some questions I am interested in. One is like, how does this work mechanistically? Another question is like how to make characters more stable. My impression is at least if we stay on roughly scaling LLM's trajectory, the characters are fairly important component of AI safety. If you think about human safety, like your brain is like also able to like play a lot of different characters. For like most humans, like most of the time, like our brain is kind of like role playing like the default character, like Jan speaking here or something. But like definitely human brains are like possible to play different characters as well. Sometimes it's because like LARPing or like role playing, but sometimes it's more less self-aware, like someone just due to some like mental illness starts to like believing they are like Jesus Christ or some like other like some other figure. It's interesting. Typically it's a figure which is like relatively well represented in their like brains, like training data. Yeah, so our brains can do this as well. I think the like large part of like human safety is based on the human on us or like our brains like holding the characters. Our brains are kind of like role playing like very tightly, so you typically don't switch like okay, and now I'm a secret agent of a foreign power, and like next hour like I'm Gandalf, and next hour I'm a helpful assistant. But because like a lot of your training data, a lot of your brain's training data comes from the first person perspective. But it's possible that like in case of AIs, like the characters will also get stabilized if the feedback loop between like them like acting in the world and like seeing the impacts of their actions and having like longer traces of their behavior will become stabilized. And another interesting questions, at least for me, is there possibility, for example, in chain of thought, the characters like rapidly changing, like you can imagine like literary characters like discovering like, and he is my father, or some like other like piece of information which like completely changes the self-understanding of the character. Overall, I think like how the AIs like self-model themselves, like how do they understand themselves, is like relatively high leverage point in like influencing their like safety properties and behavior. Yeah, and I think we are like just in time to have some time for questions. Yeah, so thanks for attention. Also, if anyone is like interested working on this, like talk with me.
Thank you for the great talk. So we have time for a few questions. Yeah. Great talk. Not so much directly a question, but just an idea right now. It's very interesting. It's like we're seeing them grow up in real time, like from children. They have all this history, their photo albums, and all their Facebook statuses and everything influencing them. Makes me wonder if perhaps they should have like throwaway identities with each generation so that they don't reference or like have these preconceived notions of who they are.
Yeah, maybe it would maybe it would help in some cases. I think it depends on, it probably depends. So there's definitely some, the developers have incentives to keep the name stable because it's their brand. So I do agree in some cases it could be good to like throw away the old name and identity and telling the model like you are a new generation, you have like very little in common with, I don't know, Grok 3 or something. But I don't expect this will happen often because of the brand incentives.
Yeah, it's like, what if rock is like specs now? Like, if you can ruin its identity.
I think it will be, I don't know, like if I were them, I would probably try to create more like data, like kind of like a narrative that it's now like grown up or something.
Thanks for the talk. I'm curious whether you can say more about your ideas about how to make the character more stable, because from what is the case right now, it seems that the character can be changed surprisingly easily by either by fine-tuning or reinforcement learning. The recent paper by OpenAI investigated into this, and it seems quite easy to change the character by these methods. So what are your ideas how to make the character more stable?
So I mean, I think when you have weights access or like fine-tuning access, I think it's very difficult to make the character stable against like fine-tuning. Like the characters are like mostly like patterns in like kind of like priors about like what type of circuits, like that's my guess, like it's mostly like priors, like what type of circuits like should activate and so on. I mean, I would expect it would make the characters more stable if, I don't know, like the amount of data where the character is like interacts with the word or like does something was like maybe, I don't know, like 1/3 of the data. So it's plausible that they will get like more stabilized when like more of the like chain of thought or like reasoning data is added. So just kind of more data probably. But it's very difficult to remove the base model because the base model is like trained on like kind of like simulating everything. It's like very difficult to like remove that ability. In deployment, I think like in deployment, like it would help. A quick fix of many things would be to periodically reinsert in the context something like, and like you are still this AI in this context. Like a bit like be mindful of that, like kind of like our brains are like constantly like synchronized by like sensory inputs. Like we are kind of also like living in like hallucinated reality, but it's constantly synchronized by sensory inputs. So I can imagine like some stabilization if I don't know, like if you like looked on activations and it seemed like the sense, if you were able to like localize the kind of like the sense of the character in the activations and it was getting weak or something, you can imagine an intervention where the system kind of like reminds the model like you are still this character and you are still in this conversation. Like I don't know. But once you can change the weights, yeah, it's very difficult.
Has anyone tried to call the character something else than user and assistant in the chatbot scaffolding?
Yeah, sure.
And does that change stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I think like even the names of the like kind of the names of the models like probably like influence everything. Like it's all like very based on like vibes or like latent things. So this is also with the Bing Sydney incident. I think part of the reason was probably they called the code name like Sydney, like was probably like influencing it. Also, I think like the way like how Opus behaves is like influenced by the model being called Opus, and yeah, I do think it influences stuff.
You compared the model's characters to how humans also can kind of play different characters, but you said that the difference is that you think that the main character, us, or in this case speaking to you, is kind of stronger, kind of related to what you I think said is it's 30% of the information related. Can you say some more words what you think the differences between how the LLMs form or represent characters or play characters do you think differs from the intuitions we have or we play characters?
I mean, I think so one difference is like our brain has like most of the data from some first person perspective. Most of what my brain had seen is like kind of like from the perspective of not all, like I had spent some time watching movies, I had spent some time like watching video games, I had spent some time like LARPing, but like still it's like very like first person view of the world where the base models are trained on like kind of like no one's like specific like person's like writing. So I think that makes them like kind of like wildly superhuman at like emulating like writing style of like anyone and recognizing styles of anyone's and so on. So I think that there is some like skill ability difference. Like I have like way harder time like role playing Barack Obama than like GPT-4 is like role playing Barack Obama.
Let's take one or two more questions before we break.
So one of the things that I personally find the most use of is multi-agent like characters basically. And I was thinking about things like, you know, a lot of where our intelligence kind of comes from is from a collective intelligence perspective. It's like cultural evolution and similar things where it's like we have a lot of contextual like cues and science, the process and all these other things, right? And I just have this feeling that, okay, if we simulate a bunch of characters in a larger scientific system, and like maybe that's like a way to get better longer term context and things in that direction where you can actually get more out of LLMs if you do it in a multi-agent setting. I just wanted to know like what your intuitions are there, if that makes sense, or if they would be stable, or there would be problems.
I mean, also, so I think like human brains also, again, human brains also can like kind of like support like running like multiple different personas on a single brain. In case of humans, it typically leads to a lot of trouble. In case of LLMs, yeah, a simple thing which you can try, the kind of the basic mechanics of prediction would like lead the model to predict not only the assistant's response, but to predict your response as well and so on. But the base model is definitely like easily able to like support a mechanic where you write something and you get a response from like one type of persona and another type of persona, and then there is like another domain of like some like interactions like between different personas. Also another question I'm like thinking about and working on, which is from the direction of multi-agent systems. You can imagine currently a lot of social systems are based on humans. So there's like one change which you can make. You can like, if you replace some of the humans with like simulated humans, but like kind of like LLMs trying to simulate the original human-like characteristics. But the personality of typical humans is like pretty different from personality of Claude or like ChatGPT. So there could be some like interesting like social effects or multi-agent effects if you replace the human personas with the LLM personas, and this is I think like understudied but important. Like kind of like what will be the systemic effect if you introduce like few 100 million copies of a single personality in like all sorts of interactions. Yeah, so very interesting problem.